It started with a line no one expected to hear on late-night television, least of all from the man the world calls the nicest guy in Hollywood. Tom Hanks leaned forward in his chair, the studio lights washing across his face, and for a split second, there was silence so deep you could practically hear the audience holding its breath. Then he said it, a word so sharp, so charged, that Seth Meyers' smile collapsed into something halfway between confusion and panic. The cameras were rolling. Millions were watching, and Tom Hanks, America's cinematic father figure, looked straight down the lens and called Prince Harry a traitor. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Have you ever witnessed a moment so unexpected that your brain needed a full 3 seconds to catch up? That was the moment. The kind of moment that rewrites the energy in a room. The kind that makes headlines before the show even ends. And yet, to understand why Tom said what he said, you have to rewind far beyond that one shocking sentence. You have to go back to the nights, the warnings, the whispers, and the private frustrations that finally pushed Tom Hanks to break a lifetime habit, staying silent on drama. But let me ask you something before we go deeper. Why would Tom Hanks, of all people, risk his reputation, his public image, and his relationship with an entire royal institution just to speak one explosive truth about Prince Harry? What did he see? Or better yet, what did he experience? Because no one lashes out without a reason, not even in Hollywood. Especially not someone as careful, measured, and beloved as Tom Hanks. And yet, here we are, peeling back layers no one realized existed. This story isn't just about one interview. It isn't just about a heated comment or a guest gone rogue. This is about years of brewing tension, about a Hollywood community slowly losing patience, about veterans who felt betrayed, about late-night hosts who whispered warnings backstage, and about a moment where Tom Hanks, a man known for restraint, finally reached his breaking point. But let's start with the night it happened. Picture this. Seth Meyers' studio, buzzing with the warm laughter of an audience ready for jokes and celebrity anecdotes. The energy is light, predictable, almost scripted, until it isn't. Tom Hanks sits down wearing that familiar affable smile, the one that says everything is fine, everything is calm, everything is exactly what you expect from today's Hollywood guest. Seth welcomes him with that cheerful voice. He cracks a joke. The audience claps. Tom laughs politely. And then Seth brings up the topic no one prepared for. Prince Harry. To this day, even the producers admit they didn't see it coming. They thought they were steering the conversation toward harmless territory. Maybe a quick laugh about book deals, a reference to Harry's California lifestyle, or some humorous story about royal fame. But the moment Harry's name was mentioned, Tom's expression shifted. Not dramatically, not aggressively. Just enough for the people who know him to recognize that something inside him had snapped. That's when Seth, sensing a shift, tried to lighten the mood with a joke. But it didn't land. Because Tom wasn't laughing anymore. He leaned in, and the audience leaned with him. What came next? Well, you already know the headline. But what you don't know, the real story, is why Tom said what he said, and how that moment was the result of years of observation, frustration, and quiet warnings he refused to ignore any longer. Now, before we move into the deeper layers of this story, I want you to think about something. Why would a man who has avoided controversy for nearly his entire career suddenly break his silence? Why would someone who has spent decades building a reputation of kindness, dignity, and reason suddenly speak out with a word as heavy as traitor? Is it possible he knew something the rest of US didn't? Something that wasn't public yet? Hold on to that thought, because we're coming back to it. In the days following the interview, people online wondered if Tom simply had a moment, a slip, a sudden burst of emotion he didn't intend. But anyone who knows Tom Hanks, or has watched enough of his interviews, knows he doesn't slip. He chooses his words like he chooses his film roles. With intention, with awareness, and with a deeper purpose under the surface. So when Tom used that word, when he looked into the camera with that unmistakable seriousness, he wasn't improvising. He wasn't venting. He was responding to something he had been carrying for a long, long time. But here's the twist. The reason didn't begin in that studio. It didn't begin in Hollywood. It didn't even begin with Tom. It began with a message. A message sent to Tom Hanks from someone who had once served beside Prince Harry. Someone who had seen the fallout of Harry's actions firsthand. someone who felt deeply betrayed. That message changed the energy around Tom. Those close to him say it haunted him. And once you hear what was in it, you'll understand why. But we're not there yet. Right now, we're still in the room where it happened. Studio audience buzzing. Producers confused. Seth Meyers trying desperately to regain control. Tom Hanks sitting still, composed, unwavering, as if the entire world needed to hear what he was finally ready to say. I want you to imagine the atmosphere. Eyes darting across the audience. Whispers. Nervous giggles. A tension so sharp you could cut it. Have you ever felt that moment in a room where something just changes? Where the air becomes heavier, the silence becomes louder, and every person suddenly senses that someone has crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. That's what this moment felt like. Because when Tom said that word, traitor, it didn't feel like an attack. It didn't feel like slander. It didn't feel like cheap entertainment. It felt like a verdict. A verdict that had taken years to reach. But here's the part almost no one knows. This wasn't the first time Tom had expressed frustration about Prince Harry. In fact, friends close to him recall a moment, months earlier, when Tom quietly admitted he was done protecting people who don't deserve protection. At the time, no one knew what he meant. They do now. And if you think this story is dramatic already, we haven't even scratched the surface. Because the real spark didn't come from Harry's interviews, or his book, or his podcasts, or his Hollywood red carpet appearances. No, the spark came from something else. Something that happened behind closed doors at a private gala. Something Tom witnessed with his own eyes. Something that still bothers him today. And that, my friend, is where this story begins to twist. Because what Tom saw that night wasn't just rude. It wasn't just disappointing. It was the moment he realized Prince Harry wasn't who he pretended to be, and that the world deserved to know. But before we get there, let me ask you one more question. A simple one. A human one. What would push you? Yes, you. To confront someone publicly. To risk backlash? To risk headlines? To risk everything? What would make you say, enough is enough? Because that's exactly what Tom Hanks said with that single explosive line. And behind that line is a story so tangled, so emotional, and so revealing that once you hear it, you'll never see Prince Harry or Tom Hanks the same way again. But don't worry, we're going there. Slowly, carefully, step by step, because the truth is never simple. And the truth behind Tom's outburst is more shocking than you think. But before we reveal what Tom witnessed, what message he received, what conversations took place behind the scenes, and why Seth Meyers tried desperately to steer things away, we need to go back. Back to the night where everything shifted. Back to the private event that planted the first seed of frustration in Tom's mind. Back to the moment that made him question Prince Harry's character long before the rest of the world saw the cracks. And what happened that night? Well, that's where the story gets interesting. And that's exactly where we're headed next. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The private event that set everything in motion wasn't some glamorous movie premiere or star-studded awards night. No, it was something far quieter, far more intimate, and far more revealing. The kind of event where masks slip because people believe no one important is watching them. The kind of night where reputations aren't polished. They're exposed. It was a charity gala. Not one of those flashy, camera-heavy ones. This one was different. A fundraiser for wounded veterans. A night dedicated to honor, remembrance, and gratitude. A night where the stories in the room were heavier than the decorations. People attended not to be seen, but to show respect. Tom Hanks was there because he always is. He never attends for publicity. He attends because it matters to him. Because those stories matter. Because the sacrifices behind those uniforms matter. It was the kind of event where Tom would typically stand quietly in a corner, talking to a guest who needed an ear, a word of comfort, or just a moment of compassion. And Prince Harry was there too. Not as a royal. Not as a celebrity. Not as some global icon. He was there as a former military man. Someone who claimed to understand sacrifice. Someone who had served, fought, and represented his country. Someone who should have understood the weight of the night. But that's not what Tom saw. And it's not what the other guests saw. Let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone walk into a room and instantly realize they weren't there for the right reasons? That was Harry that night. He entered with a different energy. Flashy, loud, distracted, almost performative. Like he was scanning the room, waiting to be recognized, waiting for the applause that never came. Because at this event, the applause belonged to the people who earned it, not the people who demanded it. Tom noticed immediately. He always notices these things. It's part of what makes him who he is. He reads people. He watches quietly. Not because he's judging, but because he cares. He saw the way Harry breezed past a group of veterans hoping to shake his hand. He saw the way Harry paused only when he noticed an influential Hollywood producer nearby. He saw the way Harry seemed more interested in networking than honoring the reason everyone was there. And then came the moment. The moment Tom would later tell friends he couldn't forget. A wounded veteran in a wheelchair rolled forward, wanting to speak to Harry. Not for a photo, not for attention, just to acknowledge shared experience. To connect. Harry glanced at him. Just glanced. And then he kept walking. Did he not see him? Did he ignore him on purpose? Was he simply distracted? People can debate that forever. But perception matters. Moments matter. And to the people who watched it happen, it mattered a lot. Tom Hanks was only a few feet away. He froze. The entire exchange lasted maybe 5 seconds. But those 5 seconds would sit inside Tom's head long after the event ended. Because for Tom, who has spent years working with veterans, listening to their stories, learning their pain, what he saw wasn't just rude. It was personal. And that veteran, the one Harry brushed past without a second thought, reached out months later. And when Tom read that message, he recognized the name instantly. Do you see the pattern forming? One moment doesn't define a person, but one moment reveals a lot. Tom didn't confront Harry that night. That's not who he is. He didn't pull him aside or make a scene. He didn't whisper to other guests or stir drama. He simply observed, absorbed, and filed the moment away in that quiet place where only truly disappointing things go. But make no mistake, that night planted a seed. A seed that would grow as Tom watched Harry's public behavior shift over the years. As he watched interviews filled with contradictions. As he watched statements that clashed with private stories. As he watched Harry speak on military issues in ways that rubbed veterans the wrong way. And as he watched Harry's celebrity evolve into something louder, messier, and more self-focused, Tom felt something inside him tightening. And that tightening grew stronger every time a veteran reached out with a story. A concern. A disappointment. A sense of betrayal. So when the message arrived the week before Tom's appearance on Late Night with Seth Meyers, it felt like the final drop in a cup already overflowing. The message wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It was simply honest. Raw. Painful. A veteran expressing how Harry's words had hurt him. How his portrayal of the military felt twisted. How the public narrative didn't match the reality they remembered. Tom didn't respond immediately. He sat with it. He thought about it. He brought it up with a close friend. And that friend told him something he wasn't expecting. You've been quiet for too long. Let that sink in. Tom Hanks. Quiet for too long. The man who rarely speaks out about anyone. The man who avoids controversy as naturally as he breathes. The man whose Hollywood career is built on kindness, diplomacy, and steadiness. If someone like that feels pressure to speak, something must have pushed him there. So imagine Tom walking into the late-night studio the night of the interview. Imagine him carrying that message in his mind. Imagine him still thinking about that charity event years earlier. Imagine him recalling every veteran who pulled him aside over time, quietly expressing disappointment. Now, imagine Seth Meyers bringing up Prince Harry. And imagine Tom deciding, in a split second, that he wasn't going to pretend anymore. You can almost feel it, can't you? That moment where thought becomes action. That moment where silence becomes truth. That moment where Tom Hanks, Hollywood's gentle voice, finally says the thing he's been holding in for years. But here's where this story becomes even more fascinating. Because while the world heard the line he delivered on camera, what they didn't hear, the part that spilled out during the break, the part caught by the wrong microphone, the part whispered in Tom's dressing room after the show, is even more shocking. And yes, we're going to get to all of that. But not yet. Right now, we're standing in the doorway of the real story. The story behind the outburst. The story behind the frustration. The story behind Tom's decision to speak. Because understand this, Tom Hanks does nothing halfway. If he speaks with purpose. And the purpose behind that night goes much deeper than the public knows. So before we jump forward into the recording, the off-air confrontation, and the ripple effect that shook both Hollywood and the palace, we need to understand the emotional foundation of all of this. We need to understand what Tom truly believes about loyalty, respect, integrity, and service. We need to understand the kind of man he is, and why he felt Harry violated something bigger than politics or celebrity drama. Because Tom calling someone a traitor isn't casual. It's intentional, measured, and loaded with meaning. And if you think that meaning is shocking now, wait until you see how it connects to the story Harry hoped would never resurface. Because that story, the unfinished, unresolved, deeply uncomfortable one, is coming. And when we get there, you'll understand every word Tom said. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't dramatic flair. It wasn't a PR stunt. Tom Hanks' viral takedown of Prince Harry wasn't born in that moment under the studio lights. It was the result of something far more dangerous. A slow burn. And if you've ever felt it yourself, you know what I mean. That creeping sensation over time that something isn't right. That someone isn't who they say they are. That what once felt admirable now feels off. Twisted. Manipulated. That's exactly what was happening with Tom. Let me take you back, way before Seth Meyers, before the cameras, before the word traitor echoed across social media like a cannon shot. This started years earlier. And the warning signs were there, if you were paying attention. At first, it was subtle. Tom Hanks, known for his generosity, empathy, and almost supernatural ability to stay out of celebrity gossip, began to disengage from certain conversations when Prince Harry came up. Not rudely, not dramatically, just a pause, a changed subject, a look, a polite silence. People close to him noticed. And when asked about Harry's new ventures, be it the bombshell interviews, the memoir, or the docuseries, Tom would often respond with the same phrase. He's finding his path. At the time, it seemed supportive, even diplomatic. But for those who really listened, it was loaded. Because in Hollywood, finding your path isn't always a compliment. It's often code for, they don't know who they are. Or worse, they've lost their way. You have to understand something about Tom Hanks. He doesn't criticize publicly. Ever. His silence is louder than most people's rants. And his patience? Legendary. So when he started dodging questions about Harry, that was red flag number one. Still, the public didn't see it. How could they? To the world, Harry was still transitioning. He was still the runaway royal. The rebel prince breaking free from a centuries-old institution. A symbol of independence, authenticity, and emotional vulnerability. But Tom saw something else. He saw a pattern. A pattern of self-destruction masked as bravery. A pattern of victimhood laced with privilege. A pattern of storytelling that seemed to shift depending on who was watching. And the tipping point? It didn't happen overnight. It happened in layers. Layer after layer of interviews, headlines, and contradictions that began to unsettle people behind the scenes. Especially people who had served. Especially people who had sacrificed. Especially people who didn't have a global PR machine spinning their narrative every step of the way. But what really lit the fuse was Harry's book. Let's talk about it. You know the one. The memoir that exploded like dynamite across every news outlet. The one filled with confessions, criticisms, and carefully curated chaos. Tom read it. Of course he did. Everyone in the industry did. But when Tom closed that book, he didn't praise the vulnerability. He didn't marvel at the courage. He didn't celebrate the literary drama. He sat quietly for a long time. And then he said one thing, according to a close friend. This isn't truth. It's theater. Let that land. Tom Hanks, Mr. Storyteller himself, calling out a royal memoir as performative, not honest. Why? Because Tom believes in the power of story to heal, not to manipulate. To enlighten, not to deceive. He's spent decades honoring real pain, real sacrifice, real growth through his work. And what he saw in Harry's book felt different. Manufactured. Convenient. Hollow. It wasn't just that Harry told his story. It was the way he told it. Glossing over inconsistencies. Blaming everyone but himself. Painting a picture that left many of his past allies, family, friends, comrades, in the shadows while he bathed in the spotlight. And that's when Tom began speaking, quietly at first, to people he trusted. He started asking questions. Real questions. Not tabloid ones. Not gossip. But the kind of questions only someone deeply invested in truth would ask. Did this really happen the way he said it did? Why does he always seem to come out as the hero? Have you noticed the details keep changing? And those questions, repeated over time, painted a picture. A disturbing one. Because the more Tom asked, the more stories he heard. From people in the industry. From veterans. From event organizers. From friends of friends who had encountered Harry and left the experience feeling disappointed. Not because Harry was rude. Not because he was arrogant. But because he seemed hollow. Disconnected. And worst of all, inauthentic. Let me pause and ask you something. Have you ever met someone who smiles with their mouth, but not with their eyes? That's the feeling many of these people described. And it stuck with Tom. Because authenticity is everything to him. It's the core of who he is, both as an actor and as a person. It's why people trust him. Why audiences cry when he cries. Laugh when he laughs. Believe him when he says nothing at all. So when he saw someone using authenticity as a costume, it offended him. Deeply. But again, he didn't go public. Not yet. He waited. And he watched. And then came the interviews. The high-profile sit-downs. The Netflix specials. The podcast appearances. And with every new clip, every new quote, every new complaint, Tom's silence became harder to maintain. Because what he saw was a man digging deeper and deeper into self-pity. A man who had access to wealth, status, security, and global influence, yet insisted on painting himself as a powerless victim. And for someone like Tom, who has stood beside real victims of war, abuse, poverty, and injustice, it felt wrong. Very wrong. Then came the moment that broke the dam. The moment Tom received that message from a veteran. The one we mentioned in the introduction. The one who had served near Harry. The one who described in brutal honesty how Harry's words were hurting people on the ground. It wasn't angry. It was exhausted. Disappointed. Heartbroken. That message wasn't about politics. It was about pain. Real pain. The kind of pain that doesn't trend on Twitter, but echoes in hospital rooms and therapy sessions. The kind of pain that doesn't make headlines, but ruins lives. And for Tom, that was it. The slow burn had reached the surface. The time for silence was over. So when he agreed to appear on Seth Meyers' show, he knew what he was going to say. He didn't write it down. He didn't rehearse it. But he knew. And when the moment came, he let it drop. A single word. A word he never thought he'd say on live television, but one that had been sitting inside him for years. Traitor. And if you're wondering why that word, why not liar, or narcissist, or hypocrite, just wait. Because the next chapter reveals the moment Tom first started using that word behind closed doors. The private gala. The silent witness. The truth Harry never wanted to surface. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It wasn't meant to be public. No cameras. No press. No tabloids waiting outside. It was supposed to be one of those discreet, behind-closed-doors affairs. A private evening for Hollywood insiders, influential veterans, and philanthropic heavyweights. The kind of gathering where speeches are heartfelt, the drinks are quiet, and the guest list is limited to people who know how to carry themselves with respect. That night, everything was supposed to be simple. And then Prince Harry walked in. It was years before his memoir. Before the Oprah interview. Before the Netflix deals. Back when the world still saw him as the cheeky royal, trying to find peace in California. The narrative was still charming. Still hopeful. But what happened inside that ballroom would mark the beginning of the end for that perception, at least in the eyes of Tom Hanks. Let's set the scene. Picture a warm evening in Los Angeles. The venue. A private hilltop estate overlooking the city, dressed in soft gold lighting and lined with American flags and royal purple accents. A symbolic nod to the theme of the night, honoring transatlantic military cooperation. Soldiers from both sides of the pond. Shared sacrifices. Shared stories. Shared grief. Tom Hanks was one of the keynote attendees. Not a speaker, just a guest, but a highly respected one. A man who had spent years quietly supporting military families, funding scholarships, visiting hospitals, and listening more than talking. His presence wasn't promotional. It was personal. And that night, he was at ease. Until the moment Harry arrived. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Most people in the room didn't even realize Harry was on the guest list. He was a last-minute addition, rumored to have been invited by a media executive trying to curry favor with both Hollywood and Buckingham Palace. He entered the room with a confident stride, not arrogant, but elevated. Like he expected the air to shift when he entered. And it did, but not in the way he hoped. There was an awkward pause. People turned. Some stood. Some didn't. Murmurs floated around. One guest would later say, "It felt like the energy in the room dipped 10 degrees. Not because we hated him, but because we didn't know which version of him was showing up." Let that sit. Which version of Harry? Because by then, he'd already started to shape-shift. One moment, he was the royal rebel. The next, a wellness guru. The next, a media critic. Then suddenly, a media participant. And Tom noticed that shift more than anyone. He watched Harry glide from group to group, shaking hands, laughing too loudly, speaking over others. And then came the moment that truly struck him. A small group of veterans stood near the bar, quietly speaking about PTSD support initiatives. One of them, a U.S. Marine with visible scars, wore his uniform despite the casual dress code. Harry approached. At first, it seemed respectful. He shook hands, nodded, even clapped one man on the back. But then, mid-conversation, he pulled out his phone and started texting, right in front of them. He didn't excuse himself. He didn't apologize. He just disconnected. And not for a moment. Long enough for the men to glance at each other with that uncomfortable recognition. He's not here for us. He's here for something else. Tom Hanks was standing nearby. He saw it all. He saw how the Marine's posture changed. He saw how the other men gently backed away. And he saw how Harry never noticed. That moment stayed with Tom. He later described it to a friend as a gut punch of disrespect. But it got worse. Because after that encounter, Harry made his way to the front of the room where a private stage had been set up. Not for public performances, but for intimate stories. Veterans were invited to share their journeys in a safe, quiet space. No cameras, no judgment. And one by one, they took the stage. One man shared how he lost both legs in a roadside explosion. A woman spoke about the silence she returned to after service. The trauma, the isolation. Tears were shed. Applause was quiet but genuine. And then it was Harry's turn. He hadn't been scheduled to speak, but he was invited to share a few words, as someone who had served, too. What should have been a humble moment turned into something else entirely. He started off well, thanked the veterans, acknowledged their stories. But then he shifted. He began comparing their sacrifices to the emotional turmoil of his childhood. He spoke about the loss of his mother, the British press, his struggles with palace protocol. The audience froze. Not because those weren't valid struggles, but because the tone had changed from solidarity to spotlight. One veteran whispered under his breath, "Is this about us or him?" Tom Hanks didn't whisper. He simply stood up and walked outside. Now, understand how significant that is. Tom doesn't cause scenes. He doesn't storm out. He doesn't embarrass people. But walking out was, in his world, the loudest statement he could make. A few others followed. The room was split. Some defended Harry, said he was just trying to relate. Others agreed with Tom, said he'd missed the moment entirely. But one thing was clear. That night changed how Tom Hanks saw Prince Harry. From that moment on, something shifted in him. Something hardened. Something broke. He no longer saw Harry as a misguided royal. He saw him as something worse. A man willing to center himself, even in spaces meant for others. A man who spoke of service, but seemed to understand nothing about it. And that's when Tom started using the word performative behind closed doors to describe Harry's public persona, to describe the way he appeared in documentaries, to describe the way he talked about mental health while stepping on others' pain. Tom wasn't angry. He was heartbroken because he had wanted to believe in Harry. Like so many of us, he had wanted the fairy tale of the rebel prince doing good in the world. But what he saw that night wasn't a rebel. It was a spotlight chaser. And that realization would stay with him for years, quietly simmering beneath the surface, until Seth Meyers brought up Harry's name, and the dam broke. But remember that group of veterans Harry texted in front of? One of them never forgot. And months later, he sent Tom a message that reignited every emotion from that night. And that message? It would become the match that lit the powder keg. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Why would one message, just a few lines on a screen, cause one of Hollywood's most respected figures to go from years of silence to explosive truth-telling on national television? Why would a man like Tom Hanks, careful and composed, suddenly snap? Why would he look into the camera, live in front of millions, and say something so inflammatory that it shook both Hollywood and the House of Windsor? To answer that, you have to understand what was inside that message. But more than that, you have to understand who it came from. Let's rewind. The Marine Harry brushed off at that charity gala? The one who stood patiently waiting to share a quiet moment of solidarity with the former royal-turned-Netflix executive? He never forgot that moment. And he never told anyone how much it hurt. Not until much later. Because for veterans, especially the ones who've been through real, soul-altering war, silence becomes second nature. You don't complain. You don't dwell. You carry it. But sometimes, you reach a limit. And this veteran, his name was Alex, a double amputee with 2 tours under his belt, reached his. It started when Harry's memoir hit the shelves. Alex picked up the book reluctantly. He wanted to give Harry the benefit of the doubt. After all, he had once respected him. During Harry's early Invictus Games days, Alex had even told friends, at least he gets it. At least he shows up. But page after page of that book broke something in him. Not because Harry talked about trauma, not because he described his service, but because of the way he did it, because of what he left out, and because of what he exaggerated. There was a specific section, the one where Harry described taking lives in combat, and compared it to removing pieces from a chessboard, that hit Alex like a gut punch. You don't talk like that. Not if you've really been there. Not if you understand the cost of what that means. To say those words in print. To profit from them. To reduce human life to pawns? That wasn't brave. That wasn't vulnerable. That was cold. Calculated. It felt like betrayal. To the men who never came home. To the families who still lay flowers on empty graves. To the survivors like Alex, who lived every day with the burden of memory and would never speak of it like that. And then there was the other detail. A small line in the book, easily missed, where Harry referenced a conversation with a fellow soldier who had supposedly laughed off a horrifying injury. It sounded like a joke, like bravado, but the soldier Harry claimed to quote, he was real, and he was a friend of Alex's. And according to Alex, he never said that. He never laughed about his wounds. He never made light of what he'd been through. And he had never given Harry permission to turn him into a soundbite. Alex didn't go to the press. He didn't rant online. He did one thing. He sent a message to the one man he knew would understand. Tom Hanks. Why Tom? Because Alex had met him twice. Once at a hospital, once at a small veterans dinner. Both times, Tom remembered his name, remembered his story, sent him a signed photo for his daughter with a handwritten message. You are your father's strength. Tom didn't do it for publicity. He did it because he cared. So when Alex sent that message, it wasn't a demand. It wasn't angry. It was just real. And here's what it said, word for word. Mr. Hanks, I don't expect a response. I just needed to say this to someone who still respects what service means. I read the book. I saw the interviews. I watched the whole circus. And I need you to know, it hurts. I saw the way he looked through me that night at the gala. I brushed it off. Told myself maybe he was distracted. But after everything he said lately, I think I was wrong. He doesn't get it. He never did. And maybe that's fine. But then he shouldn't speak for us. He shouldn't sell us. He shouldn't pretend. Because we don't get documentaries. We don't get publishers. We just get ghosts. That's all I wanted to say. That message wrecked Tom. He read it in the early morning hours, before sunrise. According to a source close to him, he sat at his kitchen table for over an hour, staring at his phone, saying nothing. He reread it 7 times. And then he quietly whispered, he shouldn't speak for us. That line stuck. And that's when the anger finally surfaced. Not the loud kind. Not the performative kind. The kind that brews inside someone who has stayed quiet for too long. Tom didn't forward the message. He didn't screenshot it. He didn't tell anyone at first. But something changed in him that day. He began pulling away from projects involving certain people. He declined invites where he knew certain names would appear. He even confided in his wife, Rita Wilson, saying, I think I've let things slide too long. I've let my silence do damage. Let that settle for a second. Tom Hanks, a man known for thoughtful restraint, believed his silence had become complicity. That's when the decision was made. When the invitation came from Seth Meyers' team for a lighthearted sit-down about Tom's latest film, he said yes. But with one condition, no pre-approved topics. Unusual? Extremely. But not for someone with a mission. And Tom had one. He wasn't going to ambush. He wasn't going to smear. He was going to speak truth, even if it cost him. But he also knew the world needed to hear more than just his voice. Which is why, during the prep call for the show, When producers asked him if there was anything he didn't want to talk about, he said, "Nothing's off limits." Not even him. They didn't ask who him was. They knew. The team reportedly scrambled. One source claimed a frantic call was placed to a royal contact to prepare for damage control. But by then, the train had already left the station. And what was most alarming, Tom wasn't angry when he showed up at the studio. He was calm, measured, focused, like someone about to give a eulogy, not a hit piece. Because in his eyes, something sacred had already died, and someone had to say it out loud. The message from Alex didn't just push him over the edge. It pulled him back to center, to the reason he had always supported veterans, to the real stories, the quiet dignity, the scars that don't trend. And when Seth Meyers mentioned Prince Harry on air, casually, as part of a joke about book deals, that was it. The final spark. Tom leaned in and said the word he'd been holding in since the day he read that message. Traitor. But he didn't stop there. Because after the break, when the show went off air, Tom said something even more devastating. And it wasn't meant to be recorded. But it was. And what that recording captured would blow the roof off everything. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Hollywood doesn't forget. It might forgive. It might go quiet. It might even pretend for the cameras. But it doesn't forget. And that's the rule Prince Harry either never learned or chose to ignore. Because before the world saw him as a global figurehead for speaking his truth, and before Tom Hanks dropped the word traitor like a thunderclap on Late Night with Seth Meyers, the tension was already thick behind closed doors in Hollywood's inner sanctums. Tension Harry helped create. You see, Tom Hanks wasn't the only one watching Harry's moves with unease. He was just the first to speak. But behind him stood an entire network of people who had been quietly growing frustrated, disappointed, and yes, offended. Let's go back to the beginning. When Harry and Meghan first landed in California, stepping away from the royal firm, stepping into the world of Netflix, Spotify, production companies, wellness summits, chicken coop photo shoots, they were welcomed like any other new celebrity couple trying to reinvent themselves. But here's the thing about Hollywood. It loves reinvention. Until it smells arrogance. At first, big names reached out. Producers, showrunners, agents, philanthropists. Everyone wanted a piece of the royal-turned-rebel brand. But very quickly, something strange began happening. Phone calls went unanswered. Meeting times were changed, abruptly and often without explanation. Agreements, even verbal ones, were treated casually, and sometimes never followed up on at all. And yet, when cameras were on, Harry was warm, charming, relatable. The disconnect didn't go unnoticed. One Netflix executive reportedly told a colleague, "It's like working with a guy who wants the documentary, but doesn't want to do the documentary." Another producer, who asked not to be named, said, "He's playing a role, not living a life." But most notably, something else caught people off guard. Harry's tendency to correct others, particularly in rooms filled with creatives, some of whom had decades of experience more than him. In a pitch meeting for a mental health docuseries, Harry allegedly interrupted a veteran writer mid-sentence to say, "That's not how trauma works." Let me explain. Except the writer? She was a licensed psychologist who had treated PTSD survivors for over 20 years, and she didn't appreciate being spoken to like an intern. Guess who was also on that call? Someone from Tom Hanks' camp. And word spread fast. You might think, come on, it's Hollywood. People step on toes all the time. True. But it's how you step that makes the difference. Harry didn't just step, he stomped. Unintentionally. Maybe. But in Hollywood, optics are everything. Especially when your entire brand is built on compassion, empathy, and understanding what people go through. The dissonance grew louder. At charity events, some A-listers whispered privately that Harry seemed to always be auditioning. At industry panels, others noted he often showed up late, or sometimes not at all. And at more than one gathering, Harry was overheard mocking the Hollywood press. "At least the British ones are honest about being brutal," he allegedly said. That didn't land well, especially considering he was now profiting from the same industry he publicly dismissed. People noticed. People remembered. And here's the irony. Harry was trying to navigate Hollywood like a royal, expecting deference, but offering little in return. What he didn't understand is that Hollywood royalty plays by different rules. Respect is earned, not inherited. And if there was one man who symbolized that code, it was Tom Hanks, a man who never asked for attention, but always received it. A man who remembered crew names, who helped young writers, who answered every question with grace, even when exhausted. Tom had built a legacy not just with talent, but with decency. And as Harry's inconsistencies piled up, interview after interview, contradiction after contradiction, Tom watched and waited. One source close to Tom said he wanted to believe Harry was just going through something, that the noise would settle and the man would appear. But that's not what happened. Instead, things escalated. The Oprah interview aired, and while it shocked the public, it left many in Hollywood scratching their heads. Why? Because several behind-the-scenes details didn't line up with what they personally knew to be true. One publicist reportedly said, he wants people to think he escaped some cage, but he's doing more media now than when he was in the royal family. The sentiment kept growing. And then came the infamous Zoom call, a private industry roundtable meant to discuss media literacy and public trust in journalism. Tom Hanks was invited. So was Prince Harry. And what was supposed to be a productive conversation turned into something else. Harry, passionate, unfiltered, began criticizing not just tabloids, but traditional media outlets as well. He questioned their motives. He accused them of manipulating facts. He implied the public was being deliberately dumbed down. Tom, quiet until that point, politely raised his hand. And what he said next caught everyone off guard. I've worked with reporters my whole life. Some good, some bad. But I've never treated the truth as something I own. It doesn't belong to me, or you, or anyone. It just is. The moment we decide we're the only ones who get to define it, we stop being honest and start being dangerous. The silence on that Zoom call, you could feel it through the screen. Harry didn't respond, but his expression changed. Not angry, something else. Embarrassed, maybe even exposed. And Tom, he logged off quietly minutes later. He didn't mention it again. Until the night of Seth Meyers' show. So why does this matter? Because Harry didn't just alienate Tom Hanks. He alienated the entire invisible network of people who keep Hollywood spinning. Producers, directors, veterans, advocates, assistants, editors, publicists, crew members, people who talk, people who remember, people who started saying, he's not who we thought he was. And once that sentiment grows in this town, it's nearly impossible to reverse. Because here's the truth. Hollywood can survive bad actors. It can survive egos. It can survive scandals. But what it can't survive is inauthenticity. The moment people feel like you're faking it, the moment your words don't match your actions, they turn. Quietly, slowly, but permanently. And that's exactly what happened with Harry. By the time Tom went on air and said what he said, the silence around him had already become agreement. No one stood up to defend Harry publicly. No A-listers rushed to tweet support. Because privately, they'd been feeling the same way for a long time. But it was Tom, trusted, respected, unshakably decent, who gave them the courage to say, yeah, me too. And that brings us back to Seth Meyers. To the moment Tom leaned forward. To the moment the word traitor left his mouth. But the context? The private gala. The broken veteran. The disrespect behind the smile. The Zoom call. The arrogance. The contradiction. All of it exploded in that one word. But the most chilling part? It didn't end there. Because right before the show started, Seth was warned. Someone from Tom's team said something offhand. A gentle nudge. A heads up. A whisper that would haunt him later. And what was that warning? You're not ready for it yet. But it's coming. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Hey, just a heads up. That's how it began. A quiet voice backstage, nearly drowned out by the hum of laughter from the studio audience and the last-minute buzz of makeup artists and cue card runners. Someone from Tom Hanks' team leaned in, just loud enough for one of Seth Meyers' senior producers to hear. He's not going to play softball tonight. The producer blinked. Sorry, Tom. He's got something to say, and he's not going to hold back. That was it. No elaboration. No dramatic pause. Just a warning. And in hindsight, Seth Meyers would admit, he didn't take it seriously enough. Because when you hear Tom Hanks and not playing softball in the same sentence, it doesn't compute. That's like saying Santa Claus is showing up angry. It just doesn't fit. And that's exactly why no one prepared. But Tom had made up his mind. By the time he walked into the studio that evening, the choice had been made. He wasn't going to rant. He wasn't going to shout. But he was going to speak. Even if it made people uncomfortable. Even if it threw Seth off. Even if it went viral in ways no one could control. Let me take you into the room. Tom arrived early. Earlier than he usually would for a standard press appearance. That alone was a sign. He was polite. Smiling. Calm. But not his usual effervescent self. One assistant noted he wasn't cold. He was just focused. Like his mind was somewhere else. Seth, always the friendly host, greeted him warmly. You ready to talk about this movie? He joked. Tom smiled, gave the usual warm handshake, nodded, but didn't make his typical easy small talk. He was scanning the studio, watching the crew, thinking. Seth noticed. And 5 minutes before the taping began, he made a last-minute decision. Pull the Prince Harry topic from the outline. His head writer hesitated. It's a huge pop culture moment. It'll trend. Seth nodded. Yeah, but I don't want him walking into something uncomfortable. Let's skip it. They agreed. The cue cards were updated. The run of shows shifted. No Harry. Or so they thought. Because what Seth didn't know, Tom was waiting for him to bring it up. And when he didn't, Tom would do it himself. The opening segment went as expected. Charming anecdotes. Warm laughs. A story about the making of Tom's new film. Seth asked about Rita. Tom deflected with his usual self-deprecating charm. But Seth noticed something. Tom wasn't doing his usual coast mode. He wasn't playing to the crowd. He wasn't leaning into applause lines. He wasn't sparkling. He was calculating. And then came the moment. A perfectly safe, routine question. So, Tom, you've been in this industry for decades. You've seen it all. Scandals, reinventions, career pivots. What do you think about this trend of celebrities spilling everything? Books, interviews, docuseries, podcasts, laying it all bare. It was a softball, an easy setup. A chance to say something safe like, well, we're all just telling our stories. But Tom didn't take the bait. Instead, he paused, looked directly at Seth, and said, slowly, some people aren't telling stories. They're rewriting history. The audience went quiet. Seth froze, unsure whether to smile, nod, or pivot. Tom continued. And when that rewriting starts hurting people, people who don't have PR teams, or publishers, or streaming platforms, then it's not vulnerability. It's exploitation. Still, no names. Just tension. Then Seth, trying to regain control, chuckled awkwardly. Well, we're not naming names. Tom didn't smile. He leaned in. His tone sharpened, just slightly. Are we not? Boom. That was it. The moment. The energy in the room shifted. Not dramatically. Not like a scandalous slap or a thrown drink. But in a much scarier way. Controlled. Intentional. Calculated. Seth, now realizing this wasn't a bit, tried to steer things away. Let's talk about your movie. But Tom raised a hand gently, signaling for just one more second of space. And then he said it. I read a book recently, written by someone who used to wear a uniform, a man who spoke about service, duty. And yet, the more I read, the more I saw someone desperate to be seen as a victim, even when he was stepping over people who'd actually suffered. Gasps in the audience. Seth shifted in his seat. Tom didn't blink. I don't have time for that kind of storytelling. I've met real heroes. They don't publish their trauma for profit. You could hear the breath get sucked out of the room. Seth, in full damage control mode, laughed nervously. Well, let's keep things light here, Tom. But it was too late. Because Tom finished his thought with 6 words that would explode across social media. He's not a hero. He's a traitor. That was the moment. The one that would get clipped. The one that would trend. The one that would spark a firestorm across headlines from Los Angeles to London. And Seth? He didn't know what to say. His producers, in the control room, were whispering into earpieces. Was this a joke? A scripted bit? A miscue? It wasn't. Tom wasn't joking. And he wasn't backing down. But here's the part no one knows, yet. The audience's reaction was edited before the show aired. On the live taping, there was stunned silence. But in the final cut, there was soft laughter. Light clapping. Just enough to make it feel palatable. Why? Because NBC panicked. They didn't want to look like they'd lost control of their own show. But behind the scenes, it was chaos. Seth Meyers was furious, not at Tom, but at his own team. Why didn't anyone tell me he was coming in like this? The producer who got the heads up backstage said, "I tried. You brushed it off." And that's when Seth realized he'd been warned. But here's where it gets darker. Because during the commercial break, after Tom had already dropped the word traitor, he said something else. Not on camera. Not for the show. Just to Seth. Just between them. Or so he thought. Because what Tom didn't realize was that one of the boom mics was still hot. And it picked up every word. What he said wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. It was devastating. And it involved a moment and a name that had never been spoken publicly before. A name tied to an incident Harry prayed would never resurface. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The ice in his voice. Silence can be louder than rage. And Tom Hanks didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his hand on the desk. He didn't rant or monologue like some late-night performance. He simply leaned in. And when he spoke, his voice turned cold. Not theatrical. Not angry. Just still. Still enough that even Seth Meyers, who makes his living in the realm of awkward pauses and clever recoveries, froze. Because Tom Hanks' warmth is his weapon. It's what makes him disarming, beloved, safe. So when that warmth disappeared, and his words dropped like ice onto the studio floor, the air changed. Not just in the room. In the building. People backstage said it felt like the oxygen vanished. Let's go back to the moment. Cameras had cut to commercial. On screen, viewers saw a bubbly promo for an upcoming sketch. But in the studio, no one moved. Not Seth. Not Tom. Not the crew. And that's when Tom said it. He turned slightly to Seth, low enough not to project, loud enough to be heard, and said, "I didn't come here for press. I came here because I've been carrying something. And it's time people stop pretending he's harmless." Seth blinked. "You mean Harry?" Tom nodded once. But his eyes didn't soften. He continued. "There was a boy. Not someone famous. Not in the press. Just a kid. 12 years old. Idolized him. Signed up for a military cadet program after seeing Harry speak at an event. Thought he'd be a hero like him. Wanted to serve, to help." Tom took a breath. The boy wrote him a letter. Never heard back. That's fine. Happens all the time. But months later, at a charity ball, the boy showed up with his father. They waited outside for hours, just hoping for a handshake. A photo. Anything. He glanced down at his hands. Harry walked past them. Didn't even look. Said something to a security guy. "Keep them moving." And the boy? He cried. Not because he was rejected, but because the hero he believed in didn't exist. Seth tried to interrupt. But Tom raised a hand. His voice dropped further. That boy took his life 6 months later. Silence. Total silence. The words hung there. Suspended. Sacred. Impossible. No one dared breathe. Even the stage manager, used to the chaos of live taping, didn't call the time cue. Because when someone like Tom Hanks tells a story like that, you listen. Seth swallowed hard. "Are you saying that was Harry's fault?" Tom looked him in the eye. "No. I'm saying people in power don't get to forget the weight of their image. When you play the hero, you don't get to vanish when it's inconvenient. And when you build a brand around pain, but ignore real pain standing right in front of you, that's betrayal." Another pause. And then, as if remembering himself, Tom gave a small, tired smile. "But hey," he said, "we've got jokes to tell, right?" And just like that, he flipped the switch. Seth was still reeling. He didn't know whether to return to script or scrap the second half of the show entirely. What he didn't know was that a boom mic, still live, had captured every word. The audio tech didn't notice at first, but a backup channel, used for ambience capture, was still recording during the commercial segment. Something that usually just picks up background chatter and crowd noise. Not this time. This time, it caught the entire private exchange. Tom's tone, his words, the story, and when the show wrapped and the files were sent to post-production, an editor heard it. His notes read, "Did Tom just say a kid took his life because of Prince Harry?" That clip was immediately flagged. NBC executives panicked. Calls were made. Fast. Internal debates exploded. Was this publishable? Was it slander? Was it protected by the fact that it wasn't part of the show? One legal advisor reportedly said, "It's off air. But if it leaks, it's going to look like it happened on air. The public won't care about legal context." Damage control began before damage even occurred. Producers were instructed to delete the audio from the final cut. The editor was told to destroy the backup. But it was too late. Someone had copied the file. And not just someone random. A staffer who had family in the armed forces. He didn't leak it out of malice. He leaked it out of grief. Because he knew someone like that boy. Someone who had put their faith in a hero and had been crushed when the illusion shattered. The clip, just 42 seconds long, was sent anonymously to a veterans advocacy group. It included no names, no studio branding, just Tom's voice. Raw, quiet, devastating. Within 12 hours, it had been played over 1.7 million times on encrypted platforms, shared in private military chat groups, copied, reposted, protected, and within 24 hours, the palace knew. They issued no statement, no denial, just silence, because they couldn't confirm or deny an incident they hadn't known about. But here's the twist. The boy in Tom's story, he existed. And that story, it wasn't just a story. It was personal. Because the boy's father, grieving, broken, had written to someone shortly after his son's death. He had written to Tom Hanks. And attached to that letter was a photo of his son, standing outside that charity ball, clutching a hand-drawn sign that read, "You made me believe. Please just say hi." And Harry walked past. No nod, no glance, nothing. That image, printed, folded, slightly crumpled, was something Tom had carried with him, in his briefcase, for years. Not because he wanted to shame anyone, but because he didn't want to forget. So when he told that story off-air, he wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't inflating drama. He was speaking from something that had haunted him. And now, the world was hearing it too. But what happened next? No one expected that. Because the moment the clip leaked, Harry's team went into full crisis mode. PR advisors were flown in. Legal consultants scrambled. But one question lingered across every room they entered. Was this the beginning or the end? And just when they thought the worst was over, another Hollywood legend stepped forward, not to deny Tom's claims, but to back them up. Someone who had been there that night. Someone who witnessed the moment at the charity ball. And that person? They weren't just famous. They were royalty in their own right, on screen and off. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it.